picture this, the Chicago World's Fair back in 1893, right? All this like innovation and progress, a really exciting time.
Oh, yeah.
And amidst all the exhibits, there's Clara Foltz,
Hmm.
first woman to be licensed to practice law in California.
Wow.
She takes the stage and, get this, proposes a system of public defenders.
Really?
Yeah. Imagine that, right? Everyone having access to a lawyer, whether they're rich or poor.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that that was once a radical idea.
I know, right? And of course, not everyone was thrilled about it back then.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. The idea of everyone having a right to an attorney, it's so fundamental to us now.
Totally.
But back then, it was met with some serious pushback.
Yeah, the newspapers were calling it ridiculous.
Oh, I bet.
Even accusing Foltz of, get this, promoting communism.
Wow, that's a wild accusation.
And so you wonder, like, what was going on in the legal world back then that would cause such a strong reaction?
It's a good question.
So what was it about the legal system back then that led Foltz to champion this idea in the first place?
Okay, so imagine being accused of a crime in the late 1800s.
Okay.
The system was, well, it wasn't exactly fair to those who couldn't afford a lawyer.
I can imagine.
You'd have these inexperienced lawyers,
Uh-huh.
some more interested in their next drink than the law,
Oh, yeah.
and they would prey on these desperate families, promising to help, but really just trying to squeeze every last penny out of them.
That's awful.
And then there were tons of people who had to face trial with no lawyer at all.
So Foltz saw this happening and was like, this isn't right. We need a system to protect people.
Exactly. She saw that the government was funding lawyers to prosecute crimes.
Right.
So she thought, why not fund lawyers to defend people too?
Like, it makes sense, It's about balance.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that everyone has a fair shot in court.
So she was fighting for a more balanced legal system.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that Foltz herself ended up doing criminal defense work because as a woman, it was tough for her to find work at regular law firms.
So she ended up in a field where she could really make a difference.
Yeah, and her own experiences defending people definitely shaped her vision for this public defender system.
It wasn't an easy fight, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, it took decades and some huge Supreme Court cases to really make the right to an attorney a reality.
Absolutely. It was a long road to get to where we are today.
And that's where we get to some of the most crucial moments in legal history.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Cases like the Scottsboro Boys and Gideon v. Wainwright.
Yeah.
Cases that really forced the country to face this big question. Does equal justice under law actually apply to everyone?
It's a question that we're still grappling with today in a lot of ways. Okay,
Mhm.
so let's go back in time, right? To 1931.
Okay.
Alabama, deep in the South.
Yeah.
Racial injustice is just, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it was a tough time.
And that's where we have this case, the Scottsboro Boys case.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that.
It really shows, how messed up the justice system was.
Yeah, how prejudice could just totally taint a trial.
Exactly. 9 black teenagers falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train.
It's just awful to think about.
These kids were rushed through a trial,
Mhm.
convicted and sentenced to death, all in a matter of days.
Jeez, it's unbelievable.
And their lawyers, the ones appointed by the court,
Yeah.
they were just overwhelmed, totally unprepared,
So they basically had no real defense.
pretty much.
It's heartbreaking. Like, to imagine what those teenagers went through,
They really is.
facing such a terrible situation with no one to really fight for them.
Yeah, they were just kids.
So how did their case end up getting national attention?
Well, the injustice of it all, it just sparked outrage across the country. Even internationally, people were upset.
Mm-hmm.
And the Communist Party saw this as a prime example of, racial and class oppression.
Okay.
So they stepped in to help with their defense.
So this became a big moment for the fight for the right to counsel.
Absolutely a turning point.
So what happened when it went to the Supreme Court?
Okay, so in Powell versus Alabama,
Okay.
the Supreme Court said that the Scottsboro Boys, their trials were unfair.
Because they didn't have adequate legal counsel.
Exactly. And this was huge because it set a precedent.
Right.
It meant that the state, they had an obligation to provide lawyers, especially in death penalty cases.
Yeah, where the stakes are so high.
Exactly.
So this case, even though it was incredibly tragic, it kind of pushed the legal system in a better direction.
Yeah, it was a catalyst for change.
But the fight for true equal justice wasn't over yet, right?
Oh, not even close.
There was still a long way to go.
It took another big case, Gideon versus Wainwright, to really solidify that right to counsel for all defendants.
No matter what the crime was.
Exactly. Gideon's story is really remarkable.
Yeah. It's amazing how one person's determination can change history.
Right. A handwritten petition from prison that just, changed the legal landscape forever.
So Clarence Gideon, tell me a little bit more about his story.
Okay, so Gideon, he was about 50 years old,
Sorry?
had a history of petty theft, and he gets accused of breaking into a pool hall in Florida, stealing some wine and cigarettes, small stuff. And the court in Florida said, nope, your crime's not serious enough, you don't get a lawyer.
Wow. So at that time, it was still like legal representation was a privilege, not a right.
In a lot of places, yeah, especially for minor crimes.
But Gideon wasn't having it, huh?
No, he was determined.
He knew his rights.
Yeah, he read up on the law, and from his prison cell, he wrote a petition to the Supreme Court himself by hand,
Really?
saying his Sixth Amendment right, it had been violated.
And they actually agreed to hear his case.
They did, and it just shows you how important this case was.
Yeah, like they recognized that this wasn't just about Gideon.
Right.
It was about a much bigger principle.
The right to a fair trial for everyone.
So what happened then? Did they give him a lawyer for the Supreme Court case?
They did, and get this, they appointed Abe Fortas.
Was that?
This prominent lawyer, he was close friends with President Johnson.
Oh, wow.
So you have this high-powered lawyer from Washington, D.C., representing this poor guy from Florida.
It's a real David and Goliath story, but in the legal world.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So what was the final decision?
The court ruled unanimously in Gideon's favor.
Wow, unanimous.
They said that having a lawyer is essential for a fair trial. It's not a luxury.
It's a right, not a privilege.
Exactly. And this decision extended that right to all defendants in state courts.
So this is a massive win for the Sixth Amendment.
Huge. It really reshaped the American legal system.
It seems like the next logical step after this would be to, start setting up public defender offices everywhere.
Right. Like if the right to counsel is guaranteed, there needs to be a way to actually provide it.
So did things just change overnight? Did we suddenly have this perfect public defender system?
Well, not quite. It was a big step forward, but it also created a whole new set of challenges.
Okay, so what kind of hurdles did these new public defender offices face?
I mean, right away, there were these big debates about funding.
Makes sense.
Like, who pays for this? The state, the county, both.
Right.
And then how should these offices be run? Independent? Part of the government?
Yeah, those are big questions.
And unfortunately, all this debate often led to, well, not enough funding.
And that's a problem that still exists today, right?
Big time. Public defender offices are chronically underfunded.
So even though the right to counsel was now the law, the resources to make it work weren't always there.
It's a tough reality.
And this lack of funding, it led to some of the problems that Claire Foltz warned about all those years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, you have these huge caseloads.
Right.
Public defenders working way too much, struggling to keep up.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means the quality of representation suffers.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It is. The very system that's meant to ensure justice is struggling to keep up.
And then we have mass incarceration on top of all of that.
Right, which puts even more strain on public defenders.
It really makes you question if we're truly living up to the promise of the Sixth Amendment.
Yeah, it's a crucial question. Like, what does the right to counsel really mean if the system can't handle it?
It's something we really need to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if having a lawyer even matters if they're just completely swamped with cases.
It's a good point. And there's this case from the 80s that really highlights this issue.
Okay.
The case of David Leroy Washington. He was on death row in Florida, convicted of multiple murders. And he argued that his lawyer, the one the court gave him, well, he was just so bad that it basically violated his right to a fair trial.
So he was saying that even though he technically had a lawyer,
Right.
the lawyer wasn't good enough.
Exactly.
What were the problems with the lawyer in his case?
So Washington said his lawyer didn't really investigate the case thoroughly, and he didn't present like any evidence that might have made the jury give him a lighter sentence. So it ended up going to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And they ruled against Washington. And this set a kind of controversial precedent for what effective counsel actually means.
So they basically decided what level of lawyering is good enough.
Right. And Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, she wrote the majority opinion.
Okay.
And she basically said that, yeah, maybe the lawyer wasn't great, but they couldn't prove that it actually changed the outcome of the case.
So even if the lawyer made mistakes, it didn't mean Washington would have been found not guilty.
Exactly. And this created a two-part test for what counts as ineffective assistance of counsel.
Okay, what's the test?
So a defendant has to prove that their lawyer messed up,
Okay.
but they also have to prove that those mistakes actually prejudiced the outcome, like change the verdict.
That seems like a really tough standard to meet.
It is. I mean, how do you prove for sure that a lawyer's actions or inactions directly led to a different result?
Yeah, it seems almost impossible.
And a lot of people criticize this ruling, saying it's too narrow. Like, it might miss cases where the lawyer was bad, but maybe not bad enough to actually change the verdict.
But it still hurt the defendant's case.
Right. Imagine a lawyer who misses crucial evidence or doesn't question a witness properly.
Yeah, that could definitely impact the case.
Even if it doesn't lead to a not guilty verdict.
So the Washington case kind of sparked this debate about what it really means to have effective counsel.
Yeah, and especially when you consider all the challenges public defenders face with huge caseloads and limited resources.
It's hard to imagine how they can be truly effective when they're dealing with so many cases.
That's a valid concern.
So there was a dissenting opinion in the Washington case, right?
Yes, one of the most powerful dissents came from Justice Thurgood Marshall.
Oh, wow. The first Black Supreme Court justice?
He was the only justice at the time who had actual experience representing poor defendants. And he argued strongly that every defendant, no matter what they're accused of, deserves good representation.
He was really passionate about this issue, wasn't he?
He was. He said that just focusing on the outcome of the case misses the point. The Sixth Amendment, it guarantees effective counsel as a fundamental right.
It's not just about winning or losing.
It's about having a fair chance to defend yourself no matter what.
So it sounds like we're at a crossroads here.
Yeah.
We have mass incarceration putting a huge strain on the public defender system.
Right.
And then we have this debate about what it even means to have effective counsel.
It's a complex issue.
So what can we do? How do we make sure that the right to counsel is a reality for everyone, not just something written on paper?
Well, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But there are things we can do, and the most obvious one is more funding for public defender offices.
That seems like a no-brainer. Give them the resource to do their job properly.
Right. If we can reduce their caseloads, they'll have more time for each client.
Yeah, more time to investigate, prepare, do all the things a good lawyer needs to do.
Exactly, but we also need to think bigger.
Okay, what do you mean?
We have to rethink how we approach criminal justice as a whole.
Like a more systemic change?
Yeah. Right, like prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors have a lot of power. They decide which cases to pursue, how hard to push for a conviction.
So if they were more selective about which cases they bring.
Exactly. Focus on the serious crimes.
Yeah.
And for lesser offenses, maybe divert people to other programs.
Like rehabilitation programs.
Right. That could really help reduce the burden on the system.
So it's not just about punishing people. It's about helping them too.
It's about addressing the root causes of crime.
Yeah, like poverty, lack of education, mental health issues.
All of those things, we need to invest in preventative measures.
So it's about preventing crime before it even happens.
Exactly. It's a shift from just reacting to crime to actually trying to stop it from happening.
It's a whole different way of thinking about criminal justice.
It is. It's about seeing the system as a force for positive change, helping people reintegrate into society.
It's a big challenge, but it's the right thing to do.
It is. It's about living up to the ideals of justice and equality that this country was founded on.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of public defense, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the first thing is awareness. We need to understand how the criminal justice system works.
Right. Educate ourselves.
Understand the challenges public defenders face, the factors that lead to mass incarceration.
And what can we do once we're aware of these issues?
We can support organizations working for criminal justice reform.
Yeah. Donate, volunteer, spread the word.
And we can advocate for policy changes at every level of government.
Local, state, federal.
Don't underestimate the power of just talking about these issues with people.
Right. Having conversation.
Raising awareness, that's how change happens.
The right to counsel, it's not just a legal technicality.
It's a foundation of a fair and just society.
And we all have a responsibility to make sure that right is real for everyone.
Absolutely, no matter who they are or what they're accused of.
Well said. And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
It was great having you. And remember, understanding our legal system makes us better equipped to fight for a better future.
Keep those conversations going.
Until next time, keep thinking deeply.